The disappearance of Flight MH370, the greatest mystery of modern aviation. The night of March 7 to 8, 2014 began like any other at Kuala Lumpur International Airport. Passengers were checking in, saying goodbye to family members, adjusting their carry-on luggage. No one imagined they were about to board one of the greatest unsolved mysteries in aviation history. Malaysia Airlines Flight MH370, a Boeing 777-200ER, was scheduled to take off at 0:41 in the morning bound for Beijing. It was a routine route, operated thousands of times without incident, but that night would be different from all others. On board were 239 people, 227 passengers from 14 different nationalities and 12 crew members. There were families returning home, tourists coming back from vacation, business executives traveling for work. Among the passengers, 2 Iranians were traveling with stolen passports, a detail that would later fuel conspiracy theories. There was also a group of Chinese artists returning from an exhibition in Kuala Lumpur, engineers working on international projects, and ordinary people living their normal lives. None of them knew they were about to disappear from the face of the earth. Captain Zahari Ahmad Shah, 53 years old, was an experienced pilot with more than 18,000 flight hours. He had worked for Malaysia Airlines since 1981 and was known for his dedication and professionalism. At home, he maintained an elaborate flight simulator where he practiced complex maneuvers and explored different flight scenarios. His first officer, Farik Abdul Hamid, was 27 years old and was in one of the final stages of his training on the Boeing 777. It was his first flight on that route without an instructor beside him. Together they conducted pre-flight checks, reviewed the flight plan, and prepared for a journey that should last about 5.5 hours. The takeoff and first moments at 0:42, just 1 minute late, MH370 took off from runway 32R in Kuala Lumpur. The weather was good, with no significant turbulence forecast on the route. The aircraft climbed smoothly, gaining altitude as it headed northeast toward the South China Sea. Everything seemed absolutely normal. Communications with air traffic control followed standard protocol, with the pilot confirming altitudes, speeds, and navigation points. At 1:01, the aircraft reached its cruising altitude of 35,000 feet. Passengers were probably beginning to relax, some sleeping, others watching movies, reading, or talking quietly. The flight attendants circulated through the cabin, offering drinks and preparing the in-flight service. It was a scene repeated on thousands of flights around the world each night. Nothing seemed out of place. At 1:07, the aircraft communications addressing and reporting system ACARS transmitted its last automatic message. This system periodically sends information about the aircraft's status, including position, altitude, speed, and system diagnostics. It was a silent routine, invisible to passengers, but crucial for flight monitoring. No one noticed it would be the last transmission from this system. At 1:19, Kuala Lumpur Air Traffic Control made its last contact with the aircraft. The calm voice of the pilot responded, "Good night, Malaysian 370. These were simple, routine words that suggested no problem. Some experts would later analyze this transmission exhaustively, looking for any sign of stress, urgency, or irregularity in the tone of voice. They found nothing. It was just a standard farewell before transferring contact to Vietnamese control of the airspace. But MH370 never established contact with Vietnamese controllers. The aircraft should have made contact when entering Vietnam's airspace, a routine transition that happens dozens of times a day. The silence that followed would be the beginning of one of modern aviation's greatest enigmas. The disappearance at 1:21, MH370's transponder stopped transmitting. The transponder is a device that sends information about the aircraft's identity, altitude, and speed to air traffic control radars. It's essentially an airplane's electronic signature in the sky. Without it, the aircraft becomes much harder to track, appearing only as a primary echo on radar, without identification or altitude information. In the following minutes, something extraordinary happened. The aircraft, which should have been flying northeast toward Beijing, made a sharp left turn. It wasn't a gradual turn or a course correction. It was a significant, deliberate change of direction. The plane began flying back over the Malay Peninsula, crossing the territory it had just left. Air traffic controllers in Kuala Lumpur and Vietnam initially didn't realize the problem. In control rooms where dozens of aircraft are monitored simultaneously, a few minutes' delay in communication isn't uncommon. Perhaps there was interference, or the pilot was busy. But as the minutes turned into half an hour, concern began to grow. What the controllers did not know at that moment was that MH370 was being tracked by Malaysia's military radars. These radars, more powerful and sensitive than civilian radars, picked up an unidentified aircraft flying back across the peninsula. The data showed the aircraft passing over the state of Penang on Malaysia's west coast, at an altitude that some reports suggested was as low as 35,000 feet, though this was later disputed. At 2:22, Malaysian military radar recorded the last contact with the object they believed to be MH370. The aircraft was flying toward the Strait of Malacca, the busy maritime corridor between Malaysia and Indonesia. After that, it disappeared even from military radars. It was as if the plane had simply evaporated into the night air. But the story didn't end there. What no one knew at that moment was that the plane continued flying for hours. Satellites in orbit above Earth continued registering weak signals, automatic handshake messages that the aircraft's communication system sent periodically. These signals didn't contain position data, but engineers could later use them to calculate approximately where the plane was, using Doppler effect analysis and signal response times. The discovery of tragedy. When the sun rose in Beijing on the morning of March 8th, family members of the passengers waited anxiously at Beijing Capital International Airport. The flight should have arrived at 6:30, but the arrivals board showed no updates. First there was confusion, then concern, and finally panic when Malaysia Airlines confirmed they had lost contact with the aircraft. The news spread quickly. In the first hours, there was hope. Maybe the plane had made an emergency landing somewhere. Maybe there was a communication problem. After all, planes don't simply disappear in the modern age of aviation, full of tracking systems, satellite communications, and radars covering vast areas of the planet. But as the hours passed with no sign of MH370, hope began to transform into fear. Malaysian authorities initiated a search and rescue operation. Initially, they focused on the last known position of the aircraft, in the South China Sea, on the planned route to Beijing. Ships and aircraft from multiple countries converged on the area. China, Vietnam, the United States, Singapore, Thailand, Indonesia, and Australia sent resources. It was one of the largest international search operations ever assembled. But they were looking in the wrong place. Investigators still didn't know about the military radar data showing the aircraft had turned back. This crucial information wasn't shared immediately, creating days of confusion and misdirected search efforts. When the military radar data was finally revealed, the search operation needed to be completely real. Analysis of Inmarsat's satellite data revealed something surprising and disturbing. The aircraft hadn't crashed shortly after losing contact with air traffic control. It continued flying for approximately 7 hours, until about 8:19 in the morning. The last handshake signal with the satellite was registered at 8:19, suggesting the plane crashed shortly after, when it ran out of fuel. But where did the plane fly during those 7 hours? The satellite data didn't provide precise GPS coordinates, only information about the distance between the aircraft and the satellite. This created two possible flight corridors, one to the north, extending over Central Asia, and another to the south, over the vast and remote Indian Ocean. Considering the radars covering Central Asia and the fact that no country reported an unidentified aircraft crossing its airspace, investigators concluded the plane must have flown south. This conclusion redirected the search to one of the most remote and inhospitable areas on the planet, the southern Indian Ocean. Thousands of kilometers from the west coast of Australia, it's a region of stormy seas, giant waves, and ocean depths reaching more than 6,000 meters in some places. Searching for an aircraft in those waters would be like looking for a needle in a continent-sized haystack. The ocean search, the search for MH370, became the most extensive and expensive search operation in aviation history. Ships equipped with side-scan sonar began methodically traversing the ocean floor, creating detailed maps of a region that was practically unknown to science. Ironically, we knew more about the surface of the moon than about this part of the ocean floor. The first phase of the search focused on a priority area of 60,000 square kilometers. Based on the most likely analysis of the satellite data, autonomous underwater vehicles dove into the depths, sweeping the ocean floor with sophisticated sonar. Each sweep revealed fascinating features of the seabed, underwater mountains, deep valleys, abyssal plains, but no sign of MH370. As the months turned into years, the search area was expanded several times. In total, about 120,000 square kilometers of ocean floor were meticulously mapped and searched. It was an area larger than many European countries. The cost of the operation exceeded $150 million, funded mainly by Australia, Malaysia, and China. The official search was suspended in January 2017 after nearly 3 years of continuous efforts. They found no trace of the aircraft on the ocean floor. It was a devastating result for the families of the victims, who had waited for years for answers and closure. Without wreckage, without black boxes, without bodies, only unanswered questions. But then evidence began appearing in unexpected places. In July 2015, more than a year after the disappearance, a piece of debris was found on the beach of Reunion Island, a French territory in the Indian Ocean, thousands of kilometers west of the search area. It was a flaperon, a piece of an aircraft's wing. French experts confirmed it definitely belonged to a Boeing 777 and the serial numbers matched MH370. This discovery was both a relief and an enigma. Finally, there was physical proof that the plane had crashed in the ocean. But how did this piece travel so far from the search area? Ocean currents in the Indian Ocean are complex and powerful, capable of transporting debris thousands of kilometers over months. Oceanography experts began modeling the currents, trying to work backwards to determine where the debris could have originated. In the months and years that followed, more debris was found. Pieces of internal panels, wing parts, cabin fragments were discovered on beaches in Mozambique, South Africa, Madagascar, and Tanzania. Analysis of the wreckage. Aircraft accident experts meticulously examined each recovered piece, looking for signs that could reveal the plane's fate. The flaperon showed marks consistent with water impact, but there was no evidence of explosion or fire. Some panels showed damage, suggesting the plane may have hit the water with significant force, while others appeared relatively intact, suggesting perhaps a more controlled separation. One of the most intriguing aspects was the analysis of small marine organisms, barnacles and mollusks, that grew on the debris while it floated in the ocean. Marine biologists studied these creatures, analyzing their growth and species to determine how long the debris had been in the water and through which ocean regions they may have passed. It was a form of oceanic forensic science that had never been applied on such a scale in an aircraft accident investigation. The damage patterns in the debris didn't suggest a catastrophic mid-air explosion. If the plane had disintegrated at high altitude due to a bomb or severe structural failure, the debris would be scattered over a much larger area, and the pieces would show different types of damage. Instead, the pattern was more consistent with a water impact, though the exact nature of that impact remained debated. Some experts argued that the debris pattern suggested a high-energy impact, with the plane hitting the water at high speed and at a steep angle, possibly in an uncontrolled descent after running out of fuel. Others suggested that certain features of the debris were more consistent with an attempted controlled ditching, where the pilot tried to land the plane on the ocean surface as gently as possible. The lack of black boxes continued to be the biggest obstacle to understanding what happened. These flight recorders, containing flight data and audio recordings from the cockpit, are designed to survive extreme impacts and transmit acoustic signals for up to 30 days after an accident. But despite extensive searches with specialized equipment capable of detecting these signals, the black boxes were never found. They're probably buried in sediment on the ocean floor, or in an area that wasn't searched. Reconstructing the route, using the limited data available, analysts tried to reconstruct the path MH370 took that fateful night. Military radar data showed the aircraft turning back over the peninsula, flying along Malaysia's west coast, passing over Penang and then heading northwest along the Strait of Malacca. At this point, the aircraft was clearly off course. It wasn't following any known commercial route. The pilots hadn't made any emergency calls. The transponder was off. The ACARS system had stopped transmitting, but the plane continued flying, its wings cutting through the night air, invisible to human eyes, but leaving a ghostly trail in satellite data. After losing radar contact somewhere near the northwest tip of Malaysia, the plane made another turn, this time to the south. Satellite data captured the rest of the story in fragments. About every hour, the aircraft's communication system performed an automatic handshake with the Inmarsat satellite over the Indian Ocean. These handshakes didn't contain GPS position data, but Inmarsat engineers developed sophisticated techniques to extract location information from the signals by analyzing the frequency of the signals, which changed due to the Doppler effect as the plane moved, relative to the satellite, and the time the signals took to make the round trip. Analysts determined that the plane flew in an approximately southern direction, probably on a relatively straight route. This suggested the aircraft was on autopilot, flying in a straight line over the empty ocean. The last satellite handshake occurred at 8:19. 8 minutes later, the satellite tried to make contact again, but there was no response. This was interpreted as the moment when the plane crashed into the ocean, probably after exhausting its fuel. Based on typical fuel consumption for a Boeing 777 and flight time, this conclusion made sense. But where exactly did the plane crash? The satellite data provided only an arc of possible locations, a curved line on the map representing all points that were the same distance from the satellite at the time of last contact. The plane could be anywhere along that arc. Analysts used complex aircraft performance models, considering speed, altitude, fuel consumption, and wind, to narrow the possibilities. This led to the definition of priority search areas, but even these areas covered tens of thousands of square kilometers. Theories and hypotheses in the absence of conclusive evidence. Numerous theories emerged about what happened to MH370. Some were based on careful technical analysis. Others were wild speculation or conspiracy theories. But all reflected the deep human need to understand, to find explanations for the inexplicable. Catastrophic technical failure theory. Some experts suggested that a severe technical failure, such as a cockpit fire or explosive decompression, may have incapacitated the pilots quickly. This would explain why there was no emergency call. However, this theory has difficulty explaining the series of deliberate actions that followed, the transponder being turned off, ACARS stopping transmitting, and the coordinated route changes. These actions suggest intentional control, not a chaotic emergency. Aircraft fires are rare, but they have happened. In 1998, Swissair Flight 111 crashed into the ocean after a cockpit fire. But in that case, the pilots managed to make multiple emergency communications before losing control. MH370's complete silence is difficult to explain with a fire scenario, unless it was so severe and sudden that it incapacitated the crew instantly, which is possible but unlikely. The decompression theory is more plausible in some aspects. If the cabin lost pressure at cruising altitude, passengers and crew would have only seconds of consciousness before being incapacitated by hypoxia. Emergency oxygen masks provide only 12 to 15 minutes of air. If the pilots couldn't descend quickly to an altitude where the air was breathable, everyone on board would lose consciousness. The aircraft could then continue flying on autopilot for hours until running out of fuel. But this theory also has problems. Before losing consciousness, trained pilots would try to declare an emergency. Moreover, the series of deliberate actions, including the route change that seems to follow known navigation waypoints, suggests conscious control of the aircraft after last contact, which isn't consistent with an incapacitated crew. Deliberate pilot action theory. This is perhaps the most disturbing theory and also one that best fits the available evidence. It suggests that the captain or first officer intentionally diverted the plane from its route, turned off communication systems, and flew the aircraft to the remote Indian Ocean in an act of mass suicide. There are disturbing precedents in aviation. In 1997, a Silkair pilot intentionally dove his 737 into the Musi River in Indonesia, killing 104 people. In 2015, Germanwings first officer Andreas Lubitz locked the captain out of the cockpit and deliberately flew the plane into a mountain in the French Alps, killing 150 people. This demonstrates that, while rare pilot aircraft suicide is possible, investigations into Captain Zahari Ahmad Shah revealed some concerning details. His home flight simulator contained flight data that included a route over the southern Indian Ocean, similar in some aspects to the route MH370 eventually took. However, this data was old and found in deleted files, and it was unclear whether it represented a sinister plan or just hypothetical explorations that any aviation enthusiast might do. His personal life was also scrutinized. There were reports of marital problems, though nothing extraordinarily unusual. Psychologically, there was no history of diagnosed depression or suicidal tendencies. Friends and colleagues described him as balanced and professional, but as the Germanwings case demonstrated, even apparently stable individuals can hide deep psychological problems. First Officer Farik Abdul Hamid was investigated with equal rigor. Younger and less experienced, some wondered if he could have been responsible, but nothing in his background suggested capability or motivation for such an act. He didn't have the same personal problems that were speculated about the captain. If one of the pilots was responsible, this would require that he first eliminate or neutralize the other pilot, since it's impossible to execute such a plan with another conscious and capable person in the cockpit. This adds another layer of horror to the theory. It would also require disabling or avoiding the aircraft's emergency communication systems, and deliberately flying to one of the most remote regions on the planet, maximizing the chances that the aircraft would never be found. Hijacking theory. In the first hours after the disappearance, when it was discovered that 2 passengers were traveling with stolen passports, speculation arose that the plane had been hijacked. Perhaps terrorists had taken control of the aircraft and taken it to a secret location for some sinister purpose. However, extensive investigations into all passengers and crew revealed no connections to known terrorist groups. The 2 men with stolen passports were Iranian immigrants trying to reach Europe to seek asylum, not terrorists. Their tickets had been purchased by an Iranian businessman known for helping refugees. Moreover, no terrorist group claimed responsibility for the disappearance. Typically, terrorist acts are accompanied by claims and manifestos. The absolute silence in this case was atypical. And if the goal was to hijack the plane for future use as a weapon of post-9/11's concern, why fly to the remote Indian Ocean? The hijacking theory would also have to explain the flight route. The hijackers would have to have sophisticated technical knowledge about aviation, be capable of overcoming or defeating the flight crew, and operate a Boeing 777 through complex navigation. While not impossible, this requires a level of sophistication that seems inconsistent with the lack of claim or demand. Military interference theory. A more marginal theory suggests that MH370 was accidentally or intentionally shot down by military forces, possibly during military exercises in the South China Sea. This theory postulates that governments are covering up the incident to avoid responsibility or international embarrassment. There are precedents of civilian planes being shot down by mistake. In 1983, Korean Airlines Flight 007 was shot down by the Soviet Union when it entered their airspace. In 1988, Iran Air Flight 655 was shot down by a U.S. Navy cruiser that mistook it for an attacking fighter. More recently, in 2014, Malaysia Airlines Flight MH370 was shot down over Ukraine by a surface-to-air missile. However, this theory for MH370 has significant problems. If the plane was shot down over the South China Sea, where it was last seen on civilian radar, the wreckage would have been found in that area during the extensive initial search. The wreckage that was found, years later, on African coasts, is consistent with an Indian Ocean impact, not the South China Sea. If the plane was shot down later in its flight, over the Indian Ocean, this would require military forces to track it for hours through international airspace without intervention. And if multiple governments are involved in a cover-up, this would require a level of coordination and secrecy that seems unlikely in the age of satellite surveillance and digital communications. Remote landing theory. Another speculative theory suggests the plane landed at some remote location, perhaps an abandoned military airstrip on an isolated island. This theory is fueled by the fact that Captain Zahari was an extremely skilled and experienced pilot, theoretically capable of landing the plane in difficult conditions. This theory faces enormous practical obstacles. A Boeing 777 is a massive aircraft that requires a long, well-maintained runway to land safely. There aren't many such runways in locations remote enough that they would have noticed or reported the landing of a missing commercial aircraft. Moreover, what happened to the plane and the 239 people on board afterward? Keeping them hidden for years would be nearly impossible. Satellite data also contradicts this theory. The pattern of satellite handshakes and their sudden cessation are consistent with an aircraft flying in a straight line until running out of fuel and crashing into the ocean, not with an intentional landing followed by system shutdown. The impact on families behind the technical analysis, theories, and search operations. There's a deeply tragic human dimension. 239 people disappeared that night, leaving behind families, friends, colleagues, and communities devastated by trauma and uncertainty. The families of the victims formed support groups, organizing to pressure for answers and accountability. Chinese families, who constituted the majority of passengers, held protests in front of the Malaysian embassy in Beijing, demanding transparency and progress in the investigation. Some family members spent their savings traveling to Malaysia and Australia, trying to stay close to the investigation and search. The lack of closure was particularly anguishing. Without bodies to bury, without accident scenes to visually process, without clear explanation of what happened, grief was frozen in a kind of psychological limbo. Trauma experts call this ambiguous grief, a particularly difficult form of loss where ambiguity about the loved one's fate complicates the grieving process. Some family members held on to hope that their loved ones might somehow be alive, perhaps trapped somewhere, waiting for rescue. While logically improbable, emotionally it was difficult to accept death without definitive proof. Others struggled with anger, feeling that authorities didn't do enough, didn't share information adequately, or were even covering up the truth. Malaysia Airlines offered financial compensation to the families, but money couldn't fill the void left by lost loved ones. Lawsuits were filed, some family members seeking not just compensation, but also accountability and recognition of possible security or procedural failures. Anniversaries, holidays, and personal milestones became particularly painful. Children grew up without parents, parents aged without their adult children, spouses faced the future alone. The date of March 8th became a day of renewed memory and mourning for hundreds of families around the world. Some family members channeled their pain into activism, advocating for changes in the aviation industry that could prevent future disappearances. They argued that in the age of ubiquitous smartphones and GPS, it was unacceptable for a commercial aircraft to simply disappear. Their advocacy contributed to important changes in international aviation regulations. Changes in international aviation. The disappearance of MH370 exposed significant vulnerabilities in the global aircraft tracking system. Although modern planes are equipped with sophisticated communication systems, these systems can be turned off by the crew, and there are vast ocean areas where radar coverage is non-existent or limited. In response to MH370, the International Civil Aviation Organization (ICAO) implemented new global standards starting in 2018. New aircraft must be equipped with systems capable of transmitting their location at least once per minute in emergency situations. For existing aircraft, the deadline was extended until 2023. The industry also began adopting more advanced tracking technologies. Satellite-based systems like Aerion now provide real-time global coverage, including over oceans and polar regions where ground radar doesn't reach. These systems use constellations of satellites in low orbit to receive DSB signals from aircraft, creating a truly global tracking network. Black boxes are also being modernized. Traditionally, these flight recorders stored data locally and are only accessed after an accident when wreckage is recovered. New systems allow flight data to be transmitted in real time to ground servers, creating a cloud backup that remains accessible even if the physical aircraft is never found. Some aircraft manufacturers have also explored systems that would make it impossible or extremely difficult for the crew to completely disable communication and tracking systems. While this raises questions about pilot autonomy in emergency situations, it reflects concern that someone with cockpit access should never be able to make an aircraft invisible. Airlines strengthened cockpit security protocols. After the Germanwings incident, where the first officer locked the captain out of the cockpit, many airlines implemented the rule of two, requiring that there always be at least 2 authorized people in the cockpit during flight. If a pilot leaves, a flight attendant must enter. Psychological screening of pilots also received renewed attention. While the pilot profession already involved rigorous medical evaluations, there's growing recognition that mental health is as important as physical health. Psychological support programs for pilots were expanded, with emphasis on creating environments where pilots can seek help for personal or psychological problems without fear of losing their licenses or careers. The science behind the search for MH370 pushed the limits of underwater search technology and data analysis. The southern Indian Ocean floor is one of the most challenging environments on the planet for search operations. Extreme depths, crushing pressures, strong currents, and severe weather made each search day a battle against the elements. The autonomous underwater vehicles, AUVs, used in the search were engineering marvels, equipped with sophisticated side-scan sonar. These underwater robots mapped the ocean floor with a resolution of about 2 meters, capable of detecting objects the size of a suitcase. Each mission lasted about 16 to 24 hours, with the AUVs navigating autonomously about 100 meters above the seafloor. The sonar data collected was processed by advanced pattern recognition algorithms, looking for shapes and structures that could indicate aircraft wreckage. But the ocean floor is full of natural formations and human debris from centuries of navigation. Each potential target had to be investigated, a tedious process that consumed precious time. Oceanography played a crucial role in analyzing floating debris. Experts created complex computer models of ocean currents in the Indian Ocean, simulating how floating objects would move over months and years. These models incorporated data from drift buoys, ocean observation satellites, and historical knowledge of ocean circulation patterns, working backwards from the locations where debris was found. Scientists tried to determine where these objects could have originated. It was like trying to figure out where a leaf fell in a river just by observing where it finally reached the shore, considering all the currents, eddies, and obstacles along the way. Drift analysis of the debris suggested areas of origin somewhat north of the main search area, leading to calls to expand the search zone. A private search, funded by American company Ocean Infinity in 2018, focused on these northern areas using a fleet of 8 AUVs operating simultaneously. Although they covered more than 112,000 additional square kilometers in just a few months, they still didn't find the crash site. Analysis of Inmarsat satellite data was another triumph of applied science. Engineers used well-established physics principles, the Doppler effect, to extract movement information from signals that weren't designed to provide location data. It was like an astronomer determining the speed of a distant star by analyzing the shift of its spectral lines. This analysis was reviewed and refined multiple times by independent teams of experts. While there were debates about specific details, the general consensus was that the plane flew south over the Indian Ocean. The main uncertainty was exactly how far north or south along the final arc of possible locations it was. When something as big as a Boeing 777 vanishes, the void it leaves gets filled with wild stories. For MH370, we've heard it all: alien abduction, secret military missions, even claims it was swapped with another plane. These theories, while mostly baseless, show how much we hate not having answers. A wild story can feel better than no story at all. For the official investigators, it was a nightmare. They had to sift through mountains of data and coordinate with dozens of countries, all while the world watched their conclusion. The plane was deliberately diverted, but by whom or why remains unknown without the black boxes. The case did force major upgrades in aviation, like better global tracking, but it also raised tough questions about pilot trust and mental health. While the official search is over, new tech like AI and advanced underwater drones offer a glimmer of hope that we might one day find it. What do you think happened? Let me know in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell for more stories.